and you hear about these kinds of stories that people that, this kind of research that people have done and still the paradigm hasn't changed, that was one of the things that kind of in my book, kind of a point I'm trying to make is just like, there's a lot of research here that suggests that these phenomena are real. They've
Yeah.
been reported across time, across all cultures. There's no good scientific rationale, whether you're talking about physics or neuroscience, to say they're impossible because our models don't, the neuroscience is too incomplete of a model to say they're impossible. And quantum
Mhm.
physics says, of course it's possible.
Yeah. Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Quidu, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science and consciousness, spirituality, healing, philosophy. And in addition to our online presentations with guest speakers, we offer classes and study groups also online. There are over 100 video recordings on our YouTube channel, which is Caritas Consciousness Project. And that's a nonprofit organization. We rely on the support of our members and donors to keep Caritas going. If you'd like to support our program, you can make a donation or become a member on our website. Also, our videos are accessible on our website, which is caritascenter.org. And there's a video library page where you can click on the speaker and see their videos. And so now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker. Let's see here. Diane Hennacy Powell is a former member of Harvard Medical School's faculty and of a part-time think tank on consciousness at the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. She has published articles in neuroscience and neuropsychiatry journals. She lives in Los Angeles, California, and Medford, Oregon. And her website is dianehennacypowell.com. And she has written this extraordinary book called the ESP Enigma, The Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena. And I can't recommend it highly enough. I finished it yesterday, and it is really, it not only does it cover so much in the area of parapsychology, but with research and so much information, I've been reading about these things for many years and experienced a few myself, and I learned a lot from this book out of the research that you've done, Diane, and so I recommend it really highly for everyone, whether you're a professional psychologist, psychiatrist, or just someone interested, or someone having your own experiences that you can't quite understand. This is a powerful book. And not only is it so comprehensive, but it's so easy to read. It really is, the language is very readable. So get a copy. The ESP Enigma. Diane, thank you for coming and welcome to Caritas. And I'm so happy to have you tonight here with us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm just going to put on speaker view. Okay. So let's start with when you became interested in these things. You were a math prodigy as a child, and your grandmother was a musical prodigy. At the age of 4, she could play any piece that she heard. Once she could play it on the piano, was it?
Yeah, she played the piano, and but she also played the violin. She was doing
Oh,
recitals both at a young
wow.
age.
Wow. And so is that when your interest in these abilities started, or did you just take them for granted as children can do at that time?
I took it all for granted. I mean,
Mhm.
I come from a family of so many people who are very talented. My father had three different graduate degrees in science.
Wow.
He was one of the principal scientists studying plutonium and helped to end the testing of bombs in the West as a result of that, the work that he did showing the effects of plutonium on wildlife. And he was a marine biologist, a geneticist. So I was raised to be a scientist, but I really realized early on that the most important thing to really understand was consciousness. I mean, I didn't have the term consciousness to put to it, but I just wanted to understand kind of, behavior, cognition, why people do what they do. Started off with studying animals. Why is it that animals do what they do? And, when I really started to, recognize, animals do, they have their own personalities, yet at the same time, they also have a language in the way they communicate with one another. And so I thought, well, maybe I could, apply, some of these skills towards studying human consciousness. And that's the reason I went to medical school, was to do something to help mankind and to understand consciousness.
Oh. So you have a background in neuroscience and psychology or psychiatry. Um, so what was it that inspired you to write the ESP Enigma, knowing probably that you would go against the grain in some areas?
Yeah, well, so I wanted to, I mean, when I went to medical school, I wasn't planning to just be a practicing doctor. I actually wanted to do something that would help to advance science, because I really have a strong research and theoretical bent. And I became interested in neuropsychiatry because they're the ones who study these quirky phenomena that gives you a sense of how the brain relates to consciousness. So, for example, if somebody has a stroke in one section of the brain, it can cause them to totally lose color vision. They'll see everything in black and white, for example. Or they could have a stroke in one section of the brain and forget all of the words for vegetables, but all of their other vocabulary would be intact. And so there are these like different little, kind of sort of accidents by nature, or whatever you want to call them. And I thought, well, that would be a humane way to understand the brain without, I didn't want to do research where I was dissecting animals or doing anything harmful to animals. And what I was mainly interested in was the kinds of things that we as humans do. And so I studied, trained in neurology and psychiatry, and trained with, the top people, and was being groomed to become uh, you know, a, potentially even a chairman of a department someday. And I ended up walking away from academia because I met a patient when I was on faculty at Harvard who was um, proclaiming to be psychic and wanted to leave the hospital against medical advice. And the staff thought she must be insane. She was saying she saw ghosts, and she could predict the future and things like that. And so they brought me in to just sign the paperwork, essentially, to keep her there. And instead, I started talking with her. And in the very beginning of my evaluation of her, she started to do a reading on me and started telling me things that there's just no way that she could ever possibly know. I mean, she said my husband was a chemist, which he was a biochemist, and that he was applying for jobs in two different cities. That very week, he was applying for a job back in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, where we both went to medical school, and he was also applying for a job in San Diego. And this woman even said, "You'll end up in San Diego." And I mean, and I knew that that was one of the two cities. We ended up in San Diego. And after that experience, it took me a while to kind of grapple with what had happened there. But after that experience, I realized I have to be able to understand this. I mean, this happened, and even if this is, one out of, a zillion people who can do this, it was still somebody who did this. And I was aware of the fact that in physics, if you go back to Einstein with, the theory of relativity, and what it tells us about the nature of time and space time and non-locality, and Niels Bohr, and this idea of, what the quantum world is like, and how, that things are not really what we think they are, that there really is, we live in a sea of potential, quantum potential. And when I thought about that, I thought, okay, maybe these kinds of infrequent but still real events are clues to the real nature of reality, and it's just the occasion that we see the human experience sort of exhibit some of these things that would be predicted by these theoretical physicists. And so I decided that I really wanted to study them, and I also was trained as a psychiatrist and told that if anybody says they can do any of these things or have any of these experiences, it's an automatic sign that they have a mental illness and need to be put on medication. And I thought, well, if these things are real, we shouldn't be just putting people on medication because
Trying to medicate it out of them, right?
Yeah, so it became important for me theoretically, because I thought that's the only way we could understand the brain and consciousness, but it also became important to me as a clinician and a humanitarian, because I think that we need to understand, if people are having these experiences and they're real, then we shouldn't be pathologizing it.
Right. And they some people are afraid of those experiences, and they try to they think there's something wrong with them. I mean, they believe the paradigm that we have had. And I think of there's a very powerful medium in England called Rosemary Altea. And she was told when she was a child, because she would see spirits all the time and she would talk to them, and she was told that she would end up in an insane asylum if that continued. And she had an aunt or grandmother or somebody who in her family who was committed because of that. And so she went underground with it. She was terrified, and she thought it was some kind of aberration that she had. And so she it was sad in the beginning, until she found out that it wasn't, that it was a gift, actually, and perfectly normal.
Yeah, I think that most of us probably have some ancestor of ours who, lived through the witch trials, was falsely accused of being a witch.
Yeah.
I have it. My eighth great grandmother was an herbalist, and her father was the apothecary who did research with Dr. Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood.
Mm.
Like whatever, 400 and some years ago.
Mm.
And she knew the herbs such that she was able to heal people. But because she was healing people in a way that they didn't understand, she got accused of being a witch.
Oh my gosh. Was
And
she?
well, her uncle was John Winthrop, who was the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he told her that, I mean, even though he was her uncle, even though he was her uncle and he was the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, he told her, I can't save you from, these, I mean, the church in England, was very anti-witch. And then she had the audacity to fall in love with a Quaker, and so she was toast. She had to leave town, which she did. I mean, so she wasn't burned at the stake or anything, but um, you hear about those stories and you realize that, and you hear about women getting institutionalized and declared crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And then it makes you wonder, is this just another form of, these witch trials, that if you don't just stay within this very narrowly confined boundary that's all, preset for you, that you get accused of being, something that then they can justify to themselves treating in a very inhumane and harsh way that just puts a squash to it. It makes it go underground.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's it's so interesting because in ancient times, and especially you know, early history or prehistory, shamans were accepted. I mean, they still are in indigenous cultures, but it was people understood so much more about how natural these abilities are and what to do with them and how to use them, and we lost it. We lost that for a long time. And now it seems like it's starting to gain some acceptance and, but ESP continues to face a lot of skepticism in mainstream science, despite centuries of anecdotal evidence and research. And your book was published in 2009. And in it, you say there are currently no more than 50 scientists across the globe involved in full-time in this research. How many now? Has it increased?
Boy. It certainly has increased. I mean, I'm I'm on the board of the Parapsychological Association for the third time now, and the Parapsychological Association is an organization for scientists. It's actually part of the National Academy. And so we seriously are studying these phenomena, and become a professional member. You have to be somebody who's published papers and presented at conferences. And if you're talking about people like that, we're still only like, maybe 150 members. And then you have to realize that most of us, including myself, are doing this research, and that's not what we're getting paid to do. We have a day job.
Yeah. Oh, I see. So there's not much funding for this, in other words.
No, the grants for it have been incredibly challenging to get. It's not funded by National Science Foundation or NIH. I mean, and so then you're really looking at private foundations that want to fund this kind of research, and there are just very few grants that are like that. And I've been self-funding in my research that I've been doing on autistic savants all of these years. But what's happening is that that's shifting now. It's finally shifting after all of these years. I'm seeing that enough people are waking up right now and saying, "Oh, the most important thing to understand is consciousness," or that consciousness is going to be the next revolution. And I think that there are a lot of forces that are contributing to that. But I see now, I mean, there's so much more interest. I'm more optimistic than ever that I'm going to get funding to do my research.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. That's so important. So let's talk about some examples of people with exceptional abilities. The one who first comes to mind is Kim Peek.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about it. That was amazing. I had never heard of someone who could read two books at once.
Yeah. So Kim Peek is actually the person that the movie Rain Man was modeled after. And a lot of people think that he was an autistic savant, but the reality is he actually had hydrocephalus, which is where you have this problem with reabsorbing the fluid that the cerebral spinal fluid that is in your ventricles and in your central column. And when that happens at birth, basically the cranium can still expand because it hasn't fused yet.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the baby still has those soft spots. And so Kim Peek's head expanded, and it was so heavy he couldn't even lift it upright. So if you ever see a picture of him, you'll see his head is always slightly slanted. And he had this central cavity in his brain. He didn't have any corpus callosum, which is the big thick band of fibers that connects the left and the right hemisphere.
Mhm.
And as a result of this unique brain wiring that he had, his eyes could work independently. So he could actually read one book with one eye and another book with another eye. Or sometimes he would be reading 2 pages of the same book simultaneously, just read both pages and then flip the page and then read the next 2 pages.
Oh, wow.
And
Mhm.
he had a phenomenal memory by the time of his death. He had, at the age of 56 or so, he had over 12,000 books memorized word for word, and he could recite them forwards and backwards.
Amazing.
And he could tell you how to get from any city to any other city. I mean, he had, all of the roads mapped out. He had one of these memories that was just, if he saw it, he knew it. I mean, it was that kind of memory. And yet at the same time, I mean, if you tested his IQ based on how we test IQ, I mean, that his IQ was below average.
Mm, mm,
And I mean, he had already passed, and I never, had a chance to meet him. I did meet his sister once when I was giving a talk about my book. Um, and I realized early on that a lot of these phenomenal skills, like Kim Peek had, they really challenge our sense of memory. So neuroscience has no really adequate model for memory. I mean, how is it that if memory is about you're having all of these wires intact, and it's all in the patterning of the wiring, then why is it that somebody who has less of, these connections, why is it that they have a more prodigious memory than we do? It
yeah,
didn't make sense to me.
right. Um, Plus, the body holds memory too, not just the brain, because there are stories of, people who, when they remember a certain incident, let's say they were being abused or something, the welts will come up, even if it's 20 years later. Sometimes, things like that, that it's the body itself holds memory. That's what trauma is really, in a sense, because it's the the body didn't release the cortisol and adrenaline or whatever that it was experiencing during the trauma, and so it gets held in the body. Is that right?
Yeah, well, yeah, there's definitely, I mean, I have a couple of things to say about that. The there's a whole branch of healing that is called body talk, and it's practiced by some people who are chiropractors. And what it is they'll find that, like, where you have a knot,
Mm-hmm.
where you have pain, it's that when they start to work on you, it actually starts to release some of the memory.
Mm-hmm.
And so they work to process the memory with you that comes up. And some people who do that kind of work, they themselves will actually they'll actually get a reading of your memory and ask you, oh, this knot's about your grandfather and something that happened when you were 6 years old, that kind of thing. I mean, it depends upon the practitioner, how skilled they are. But it's like, it's interesting because it's like, well, somehow information is being contained there.
Okay.
Um, but I don't think that the information is really being contained there as much as that it's an access point for that information. I think that it's quite possible that the information is contained in a field that plays a role in the body's manifestation of whatever. But that the information itself is contained in the field which, there's in these esoteric sciences, as I'm sure there are all these subtle bodies that are associated with different aspects of the self, and that this information that's contained in this field, that then it can easily impact the condition of the body.
Yeah, I was interested to read in your book that when you were 13, you had a near drowning incident. And I had that too when I was 10. And at the point where I let out my breath because I could no longer hold it. And so, as you mentioned in the book, you resigned yourself to dying, right? That was the point at which I knew it was over, and I had this incredible euphoria, at that moment. I thought, it's okay. It was like, I'm going home. It's okay. And I had a fleeting thought about my parents will be disappointed. They're going to be sad, but it didn't last, and it didn't, it was just this blissful. Did you have that? Did you feel that bliss?
What I felt was peace.
Okay.
That's what I call it bliss, but I would definitely say peace. I was very calm.
Yeah.
It was this strange sort of very calmly saying, well, my mother's going to be really disappointed.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, well.
But it's okay. It's okay. That was the overriding feeling was it's fine,
Yeah,
and
like somehow it's fine. Yeah, although my mother was a real worry ward, so I knew that, I knew she wasn't going to be fine, at least initially.
right.
You're in a state where it's like you're tapping into, you already know where you're headed. You already have that.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
already have a sense of ascension, or whatever you want to call it. And
Right.
so you can't get mired down into the nitty gritty feelings that we, who are just so stuck in this embodied perspective, can find ourselves engrossed in, the worries and tribulations, and it's like you're freed from that.
Yeah, and then with that, I totally relaxed. And then suddenly I could see which way was up because the sand had become so churned up that I couldn't tell which way I should be struggling. And that's why I ran out of breath and had to just let it out. But when I relaxed with that feeling of peace and really kind of bliss, then I opened my eyes and I could see the sunlight through the water. And so I knew which way to go. And then I got out, right? But I've often thought that, I remember thinking, I'll never be afraid of drowning because it's so peaceful. And I came up years later as an adult. I read a book by Stanley Krippner and David Feinstein in which they talked about it's all about your personal myth. It's called the mythic path. I don't know if you know it, but and I realized that you do all this journaling and all this stuff, and I realized that from that experience, I had formed a personal myth that said that when things are really out of control, just relax, and so it was an interesting experience. But of course, the body is programmed to survive. So as soon as I saw that light through the water, I got out and I shook for about 20 minutes or so. I was shaking from head to toe like a leaf. And I thought I was with my adult cousins, and I thought, oh, I can't tell them what happened because they won't let me in the water again. But I let myself shake because I thought, well, I just came out of the water, so they think I'm cold, right? So it's okay. I knew I wasn't shaking because I was cold. It was a nervous reaction to the thing. but I guess I released the cortisol. you know, now they say that that's can make the difference between having PTSD and not.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Uh, okay. So then there was a musical savant who you talk about, who you write about, who was born blind and could play any song. Leslie, somebody.
Lemke, Leslie Lemke. Yeah.
Was he the man I saw many years ago? I saw a documentary on a man who was born blind and he was a savant and he was, definitely developmentally disabled, but he could play, just incredibly, any piece. And his mother would carry him on her back. Is that the same one? I'm wondering. I think
It
she was
could,
Irish and she was a little thing and
it could
he
be
couldn't walk.
Leslie. It could be Leslie. He had one condition that caused him to be blind, and then he also had cerebral palsy. And
Yes, I
so
think that was it.
so he had a lot of motor difficulties.
Yeah.
Um, and he was this woman who took him on was not his biological mother.
Mm-hmm.
Leslie had been abandoned, and she took him on, and she painstakingly worked with him to try to get him to be more functional in terms of walking, and trying to help him to use his fingers so that he could even be on a piano board.
Mm-hmm.
And she uh, so she was kind of clunking around with him, just to get him to do some stuff. The piano, not thinking that he was going to become a pianist at all. She was just thinking that this is a good exercise to do with somebody with cerebral palsy, and you're trying to get them, to have, some ability to use their hands. And one night, she was in the bedroom, and she heard this music playing in the living room. She thought, did I leave the radio on? And she goes out and she sees him playing this music that he had heard.
Tchaikovsky, right?
Yeah,
Tchaikovsky.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That she hadn't taught him how to play that, but he had heard it. And so then, after that, he was able to continue to perform and, in front of
Mhm.
audiences. And so
Yeah.
it's a really beautiful story, that shows
Yes.
you that we really need to not judge a book by its cover.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I had a question about Miss Z, who had an out of body experience and saw a girl in a checkered skirt being raped. Was she able to? And then the next day, it was in the newspapers that this girl with a checkered skirt had been raped. So was she able to identify the assailant?
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, like
Okay.
I don't know those kind of details, but I
Uh,
know that she was able to then be verified in terms of her ability to have out of body experiences by an
mhm,
experiment done by Charles Tart, where
mhm,
he had a number out of sight that was up on a ledge, and then he had her hooked up to electrodes to record her brain waves. And so there's no way she could move without having it show up on the recording. But he also
mhm,
wanted to see what was going on with her brain waves when she was having an out of body experience. And she was able to uh, go and report the out of her body supposedly, and actually give this, I think it was a 5-6 digit number.
mhm.
um and so that's very, that's it's one thing to hear reports of that and you hear of accurate material, but this is one in which, I mean, that's in a laboratory setting. I mean, that's
Yeah.
validated. And and you hear about these kinds of stories that people that, this kind of research that people have done, and still the paradigm hasn't changed. That was one of the things that kind of in my book, kind of a point I'm trying to make is just like, there's a lot of research here that suggests that these phenomena are real. They've
Yeah.
been reported across time, across all cultures. There's no good scientific rationale whether you're talking about physics or neuroscience, to say they're impossible because our models don't, neuroscience is too incomplete of a model to say they're impossible. And quantum
Mhm.
physics says, of course it's possible.
It's people are invested in what they believe and they don't want to change. I have a friend like that. And she's a very dear friend. And when I was telling her about remote viewing, she just she couldn't accept it. And I said, but if I'm telling you that I was able to draw the target, what is it that you can't accept about that? And she didn't want to talk about it. So let's talk about synesthesia. One question before we go into that. Um, I'm just wondering why it's a disproportionate number of savants that are also autistic.
Yes.
Why is that? Why do they go together?
Um, well, that was one of the questions I had, that the two
Mhm.
populations in which savant skills are found the most frequently, if not exclusively, are people who are blind from early on, so,
Mhm.
the first year of life, and people who are autistic. And so, it's like, what do those two conditions have in common that lend itself to savant syndrome? And the answer to that is that in both cases, you have something that causes the brain to rewire itself because there's a typical ability that someone has that gets hijacked. So somebody who's blind, they lose their ability to see, but the visual cortex is a significant section of the brain. I mean, it's got amazing capacity for basically taking taking what was complex information that's coming from the retina and dividing it up into all the different components that then it gets reorganized into creating a visual image. And that is not going to go to waste. It's too big of a section of the brain. And so what happens is you have somebody who's blind from birth, and they can develop these other skills that use that re that basically recruits the visual cortex to do something else. Okay, so for example, there are people who are what are called echolocators, where there's this man who will emit this little clicking sound, and he uses the like a sonar. He uses the signal that he gets back bouncing off of whatever's around him to navigate. And I mean, he's even climbed, mountains. I mean, he does all kinds of extraordinary things that sighted people do. And he gets around by just emitting these little clicks, and his visual cortex. And we know that his visual cortex is playing a role in this because imaging studies of his brain have shown that yeah, his brain is actively involved in helping to create this map for him that he then navigates with. And so what you have there is the ability of sight has been hijacked, but the brain rewires so that you have a workaround so that you can still navigate. Um, and similarly with people that are autistic, their ability to communicate, their ability to engage in sort of linear processing, what we think of as left hemisphere skills, that gets hijacked. And a lot of these savant skills are really um, visual spatial skills or right hemisphere skills that are extraordinary. So it's sort of like they've sacrificed this kind of linear, um, sort of cognitive processing for what is actually a more gestalt processing, which is actually a faster, more efficient processing. The problem is that it's something that's difficult to put into words. And
Yeah.
but it still has its, I mean, it has an extraordinary place, um, but it's not what our educational system tends to value. And so these savant skills are ones in which you've got these abilities that it's just this like defies our sense of how can they do that, because so many of us are operating out of the left hemisphere.
Yeah, we have a study group that's currently reading Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary.
Mhm.
And in his book, it explains the differences between the two hemispheres. And I was intrigued when I was reading your book, the fact that you attribute autism to a deficit in the left brain, and McGilchrist describes it as left brain dominance. And I was thinking about that. I can readily see how savantism would be a function of the right brain, but with autism, it seems that characteristics such as inability to read other people's emotions and needing a lot of routine, being single-mindedly focused on one task, or idea, those things tend to lateralize more to the left brain. So I got confused as, whereas seeing in images like Temple Grandin describes, right? That's definitely more right brain to me, So yeah.
I can understand why that's confusing. And this is what I have to say about that, is that you're right that when I was talking about that, I was mainly thinking about, like, if you look at savant skills, they're usually, predominantly right hemisphere based.
Yes, I would say so too.
And if you look at the deficits that people who are autistic have, they're usually what we think of as left hemisphere deficits. This emotional intelligence is more than just left versus right hemisphere. It's that's one thing I want to say. It's really more than just that, because you have to realize that a lot of people who are autistic, they're not getting socialized.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and a lot of them are, some of them I would say they're not getting socialized because they just don't fit into the system, and they're just kept at home, because they're a management problem, in the system. Some of them are just so super bright that they can't relate to other kids their age, or they get bored with that sort of ordinary social interactions, and they'd rather be doing their thing. And so there's this. So I think there's it's not that there's socialization factors at play. I'd say that's part of it. But I'd say another part of all of this is that autism is not just one single thing. I mean, if I were to show you several different people, all of whom were diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
you would see that we're lumping a lot of people together that I don't think should be lumped together. I mean, I really think that it was a mistake when they put them all together into the same category, because you have people that are incredibly I mean, they're incredibly articulate. I mean, they don't just know one language, they can know multiple languages. I mean, they don't have anything wrong with their left hemisphere, okay? And they're super smart, but they um they don't really, they just don't read social situations very well. They
Right.
don't. And then you can have other people like these non-speaking autistic kids that I work with. They actually read social situations very well, but they can't speak.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually, what they struggle with is they can see that they can't stand the hypocrisy they see. They know what somebody's really thinking, and they see that they're saying something totally different, or they see discrepancies in their behavior. They're like, well, this doesn't, and so it's not that they're misreading, it's that they refuse to go along with society's acceptance of this as normal for
Right.
people to not be coherent.
They it's not logical to them.
It's not logical
Right?
to them. It's like,
Yeah.
why do you think that and say that and then do
Mhm.
that? They're just like, and so, so I mean, I wouldn't say that that is, a lack of, right hemisphere,
All right.
abilities.
Mr.
I mean,
Spock, right? Mr. Spock in Star Trek was could have been called autistic, like a very high functioning autistic. Yeah,
right, right.
that makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah,
Yeah. So, I wouldn't get too caught up in that, but I
right,
mainly
right.
look at it from the standpoint of savant skills. Yeah.
Hmm, hmm.
Yeah.
Um, so is there evidence that individuals who excel in ESP related phenomena have better integration or communication between the hemispheres, would you say?
People who have more ESP, whether they have
Yeah, who have more ESP, are they? You also mentioned how psychic phenomena tends to uh, induce a person to go deeper than the cortex, right? The outer layer of the brain. And um, ex- would you
Yeah.
explain that? I'm not very good at explaining that.
Well, okay. Well, let me go back to your first question.
Mhm. Integration.
This is how I would say it. Okay. So, when I was writing my book, I was thinking about, well, who is it that reports psychic abilities? I mean, where do we see this happen? And one of the things that we see over and over again is that a lot of people can have psychic dreams, whether it's precognitive or, or whether they have like a after death communication, where they have a
Right.
dream of Aunt Mary, and then they find out in the morning their Aunt Mary died in the middle of the night,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. And so, and I thought, well, what's going on during dream sleep that, that those of us with neurotypical brains, that we could potentially have these experiences. And what you see is that the right hemisphere is dominant. The left hemisphere becomes more quiet. The right hemisphere is dominant. The frontal cortex, which is our executive functioning, that's kind of the judging of what's possible or not possible. That also shuts down. Okay.
Mhm.
That's one of the reasons why our dreams can have all this illogical content in them, or we can have all these kind of special abilities, is because we're not having those expectations that this is impossible interfere with our ability to have that experience.
Right.
And so I thought, well, so the frontal lobes are less active and the right hemisphere is more active than the left. That's the picture that you'll see in some of these autistic kids where they have, evidence of something having happened to their left hemisphere and their right hemisphere is more dominant. And in childhood, the frontal lobes are not as they're not fully myelinated, which means that they don't have the inhibition on the brain the way that they do as you get older. That's why ADD, attention deficit disorder, is something you'll see in a lot of children and then they outgrow it as their brain develops. So, so, so it's really not. So it's really that the right hemisphere is more dominant in its activity, kind of the reversible of what is the
Mhm.
reverse of what is kind of the normal waking state for most of us. Um, However, at the same time, um, the right hemisphere we also associate kind of more with those processes that are unconscious that we can't really articulate very well. And so having a healthy relationship between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere enables us to articulate what the right hemisphere kind of knows, that so the right hemisphere can know it, the left hemisphere can help you to express it. And so there's value in that. What we know is not a good pattern that's conducive to psychic abilities is to be very left hemisphere dominant.
Mhm. And so materialistic reductionism is a result of left brain dominance, which is what our culture promotes, right? And in your book, I had written something down here. Oh, you say that the biggest price we pay for this left brain dominance is in creativity, which decreases as we move through the years of schooling. Most American children test high in creativity prior to school, and the percentage drops by 10% by age 7 and to 2% by the time we are adults. And this is relevant to psychic phenomena because creativity has been associated with increased psychic abilities. So that's just tragic to me. That,
Yeah.
And it reminded me of this thing that I read one time where there's a little child, like maybe 4 or 5 years old, and talking to this adult, and the adult says to the child, I teach people to sing. I teach people how to sing. And the little child says, you mean they forgot? So it's just, it's how can we change this paradigm to not be so left brain oriented, is what I often wonder. And I guess it has to do with the work that you're doing, the work that doing the research, and it just seems so slow,
Yeah, well, I think what's happened, once again, I think just like I'm more optimistic about getting funding, I'm also more optimistic that our educational system is going to deviate from, basically the straitjackets it's been putting on our kids, because the reality is that creativity really needs to be fostered. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, so much of our innovation and so much of our arts and everything comes from all, so many of the things that really make life dynamic and make us feel alive are related to the creative process. And so, um, and I think that there are a lot of people who realize now that, yeah, we need to be doing something differently, and that you can, a lot of these things that we're trying to drill into the kid when they're real little, thinking, oh, I'm going to make my kid really super smart by teaching them how to do this and do that. That's all based on reading.
Mhm.
It it's a little false, it's false-minded, because the reality is they can learn to read later. That's not a skill that they're going to have difficulty learning later. And so in the early years, I think a lot of like what is, you would see in like the Montessori schools or some of these alternative
Or the
schools,
Waldorf schools,
the Waldorf
they
school.
don't let them, and it's funny because when my kids were little, uh, sometimes before they started school, I remember my daughter asking me, how do you spell something or other, right? And I said, you have plenty of time to learn that later. Just, don't worry about that now, you know, because it just seemed to me that, and then later I found out that the Waldorf educational system says that it's not that they can't learn at an early age, they can, but you're displacing certain things that they should be experiencing by teaching them abstract concepts that until the age of 7 or 8 they should be just learning through experience and through fantasy and through hands-on stuff, and not, yeah, and that's a problem, I think, with our so many parents who are trying to give their kids a head start by teaching them these things, and then they may, suffer in some ways later.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they need to have a rich environment that's stimulating for them, but there's more ways to stimulate them than just, book.
Intellectually. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's I kind of think of it in terms of it's sort of like, as a person who's a writer, knowing that, one of the problems that a lot of people have in terms of their writing process is that they squelch the creative too early.
And that's the left brain dominance.
Yes, they
Right?
bring in the editor, and then they don't get very far in their writing because they're just they're criticizing it before they even get very far. And you have to sometimes do something that's just, the preliminary big splash,
Mm-hmm.
creative stuff out. And then once you have something, then you can work to sculpt it, but don't come in with that editor right at the beginning.
Yes. Um, let's talk about how a lot of musicians say they don't know where the music comes from, that it comes to them rather than from them, and this is not just Mozart, but even contemporary musicians. So, the Romans talked about muses, and Spiritism talks about spirit guides, which is basically the same thing. But then there's also this universal field of consciousness that you talk about a lot in your book, and that I wholeheartedly accept and believe in, agree with. So what's the difference between accessing the field and accessing spirit guides or muses?
What's the difference between the two?
Yeah.
Well, I would, I think that let me put it this way. I think that what's different is just the experience. Okay. But so what I mean by that is that somebody who says they're accessing the field, they're oftentimes saying that they're just getting a download.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people, the autistic savants I work with now, they just get a download. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just all of a sudden now they can do something. Whereas the experience that somebody has if they're accessing their guides or their muses, it's more of a dance. It's more of a relational
Yes,
you know,
definitely. Yeah.
thing. And so that's a totally different type of experience. Now, the question is, where do those muses or spirit guides reside,
Mm-hmm.
and so, I'd say, well, they probably reside in the greater collective consciousness or unconsciousness, whatever you want to call it, but they reside in, this,
Mm-hmm.
consciousness field. Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, you're technically accessing the field, but I think that the different terms are really describing the different experiences.
Yeah, the field is similar to or identical to the Akashic records that, Eastern spiritual traditions talk about, right?
Yeah, yeah, and some of these kids I work with who say they get these downloads, they also describe going to a place that has a library that sounds a lot like the Akashic records.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess it's kind of sometimes what your belief system is, or what your experience tells you. I've had experiences where I hear a voice in my head that tells me to do something, and I don't want to do it because it doesn't make sense to me. And but it's so insistent that I have to heed it. And in every case, it's right. In a couple of cases, it saved my life. So I think of that as a spirit guide. And then there are other times where I feel like I just tapped into something, a field, I guess, So I think it's, I think they overlap, or maybe, I don't know. Let's talk a little bit about dream telepathy. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there's a lot of experiments that have been done on dream telepathy. Stan Krippner, somebody you mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
and he engaged in a lot of research on dream telepathy. And so what they would do is they'd have somebody who'd go into dreaming sleep, and they could tell when the person was dreaming, because when your eyes move rapidly back and forth. That's why it's called, REM sleep, rapid eye
Mhm.
sleep. And so when that person was in that state, somebody somewhere else would be looking at, say, a famous, wouldn't have to be famous, but they'd be looking at a painting. And they'd be trying to transmit that painting to the dreamer. And then the dreamer would get woken from their dream, and then they'd be asked to draw or describe whatever it was they were dreaming about. And there would be a really a high correlation between the painting and what they described was in their dream. And then there's examples of people who have shared dreams,
Mhm.
where you have two people that have the same dream at the same time with each other in it. And it's like, okay.
Yeah.
But they're
Yeah. My two daughters once dreamed that on the same night, they both dreamed about me. And in the morning, one of them called the other and said, I had a dream about mom last night. And they shared, it was the same dream. And it was really funny because it was, they dreamed that I sat them down and I told them that their grandfather was not my real father and that my real father was Mark Twain. I said, I like that dream. I like Mark Twain. I also like my father, But it was really funny that they both had that same dream.
that they both had that same dream that your father was Mark Twain.
And the same night. Mm-hmm.
That is really wild.
Yeah.
I would love to understand what that was about, because
Yeah.
that's not a precognitive dream. It's a
No, definitely not.
yeah. And
Yeah.
did you ever get a sense of where the Mark Twain came from? I mean, where they would
Well,
have.
I mean, I I didn't take the time to ask each of them what Mark Twain represented to them.
Mhm,
But to me, he was a wonderful writer and a humorist, you
mhm,
know. And there was another part to the dream that I had cloned myself.
mhm.
And I thought, well, that's wish fulfillment because they both felt that they, we weren't living together. They were grown up. One was married, the other one lived not too far away. And and the older daughter wanted me to babysit more than I was able to.
Mhm.
And the other one just wanted more of my attention. So I thought, well, that makes sense that they both dreamed that I was cloned, that there were two of me now. Anyway, it was funny.
That
But
is.
yeah, I had a spiritual teacher who would work with his students in his sleep. And I had a dream one time when I was stuck in my meditation. I lived in a yoga ashram for 2.5 years, and we studied Kundalini yoga. And I went through a period where I was really stuck. And, I would get to a certain point and I couldn't get past it. It was like it was very frustrating. I hadn't told anyone, but this was going on. And one night I had a dream where he came, he arrived. He used to come for the weekend because he had another ashram in the city. So he would come up to the mountains on the weekend. And in the dream, he arrives and I go to greet him as usual, and he hugs me as he always hugged all of his students. And he was a very powerful energy transmitter, right? So when he hugged you, he was pouring all this energy into you, and you were trying to stay open to take in as much as you could, right? So I'm doing this in the dream, and I go into this, meditation, and I get to the part where I'm stuck, the point where I'm stuck, and I blast right through it. And I wake up and I think, wow, that was a great dream. Wouldn't it be nice if I go to meditation class this morning and I'm no longer stuck? And sure enough, I wasn't. And then he arrived, that was on a Tuesday. He arrived on Friday, and he said, when I went to greet him, and he said, "Oh, I worked with you on Tuesday night in your sleep." So I thought, wow. So he would go to sleep every night and he would say, "Whoever needs me." And then in the morning, he would remember who he worked with. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's very, very interesting. This one autistic boy, and his mother, um, have a kind of a similar sort of thing going on in that, um, he he has been able to help her to lucid dream.
Mm.
And there's been this correspondence between that where he took a card, the ace of spades, and put it over her forehead, okay, in the dream, okay, saying that this was like to open up her third eye, okay. And then the next morning, when she sees him, he looks at her and he takes the ace of spades card and he puts it on his forehead like this, like it's like a signal that, hey, wink, wink, I mean, that really happened, and
Yeah.
and she feels that he is actually, helped to open up her third eye through, those kind of contacts in her dreams.
Wow. Yeah. That's wonderful. We have so many faculties that we don't know we have. No, I think about, we used to have a center in Boulder pre-pandemic. We had a center in Boulder and Colorado, and we had remote viewing workshops, and people were always amazed that they could actually, with very little training, just go through this protocol and see the target, and we just don't know, and so we think we don't have these faculties because we're so programmed to rely on the five senses, which is such a filtering out of consciousness.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, those five senses lock us into the here and now.
Mm-hmm.
And so the only way that we have an access to something that's non-local is through the mind. And we
Mm-hmm.
tend to discount those things that the mind senses. I believe the mind is another sense. And so we tend to discount those things that the mind senses because they're not locked into the here and now. And we give more credence to that which is here and now. And we need to be, for the most part, we wouldn't be able to function if we didn't have some kind of anchor in the here and now. It's just that the problem is that there are times when we need to access information that isn't local. And that also has some survival skill. It's just you can't live in that space all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're taught not to trust our intuition, which is,
That too.
yeah. Would you say that most neuroscientists have the perspective that consciousness is a field?
No, I'd say the majority of them do not think that way at all.
Uh,
No.
so they still
It,
think that the brain creates consciousness, the brain produces consciousness.
I would say that the majority of neuroscientists think that way
Mm.
still. Yeah. And it's it's one of those things that the way that neuroscience is taught is that even though they have no clue how the brain could create consciousness,
Right.
that is one of those assumptions that it does that's treated as though it's a fact. It's
Yeah.
treated
So
as
crazy.
this is where we have to start. We have to start here with this. This is the fact, and then they pile a bunch of other facts on top of it, and then you're supposed to be, working on creating a theory for how consciousness comes from the brain, and you're never allowed to question this, fundamental fact, which is like, well, who decided that's a fundamental fact? I mean, what
It's
kind of fact? That's an opinion.
yeah,
That's fact.
it's it's a quintessential example of what they say assumption is when you assume something, It's really the quintessential thing because it is an assumption that has no substance, no substantiation, right?
That's
It's
right.
really,
And yeah, and once you say, well, let's flip that and assume that it's not
mm,
the case,
right.
then everything makes sense. It's like,
Yeah.
just engage in that exercise, then it's like all of these things, out of body experiences,
Mhm.
near death experiences, and you know seeing spirits, or being able to predict the future, or any of these experiences that people have, shared dreams, all of these things. It's like, okay, if we don't think of consciousness as being something confined to the brain, produced by the brain,
Mhm.
then all of these things, can make total sense. I mean,
Yeah.
and you can easily come up with a theory of how a field creates creates something that's material, but
Mhm.
you can it's harder to go from thinking of something material as being what creates the consciousness field. But it's easy to think of how a consciousness field could create something material.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But you can't be a materialist and think about that, and think of it that way.
Yeah.
So, so I guess it's mostly the quantum physicists who, you know, probably have more of a perspective of consciousness being fundamental.
Yes, I mean, I would say that the people that I've met who are scientists who really understand my work the most, although it's starting to shift, but I mean, the ones who traditionally have understood my work the most have been people who are physicists, who
Mm-hmm.
are capable of that kind of abstract thinking, that they realize that this, what we think of as reality, is not really reality.
Yeah.
And they're used to thinking in terms of, well, this is just this intermediate reality. We've got, a micro reality, you go down to the subatomic, Planck scale, or you can go up to the major macro scale, which is like the galaxies, the universe, which seems infinite. And it's like, look at all of that. Okay. And we're somewhere here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so these are bizarre worlds that we don't understand, all this dark energy and dark matter and black holes and all that stuff. I mean, so just because this world falls into something that that we think of as being
Definable.
definable. Yeah, it doesn't mean that it's the full reality at all. And they're used to dealing with things that are unseen.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas most of science, so science cuts theoretical physics slack. It's like, okay, yeah, you're mainly about equations and and having these kind of thought experiments and all of that. So you guys can do that. But then the rest of science is stuck with it having to be something that's measurable.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be something that's observable, and you have to be scientifically distant from it. You have to create this separation. You're not supposed to be using your intuition to try to enter into whatever it is you're trying to study. You're supposed to be, I mean, to a point you can, but not completely. And
Well, and even though some of the major contributions of science have come from dreams and, you know, who knows, out of body experiences, you know, intuitive material and not deductive material, right?
Right, exactly. So, yeah, so I'd say that the neuroscientists who are just taught from the get-go, and and you're so young when you go to college, and I mean, you're still young. You're still used to just, well, this is what I was taught in school.
That's what I had to learn.
This is what I learned. And you see these professors who are famous and that, know all of this stuff. And you just feel like, the mindset isn't to go in there challenging the system. It's more that, gee, I've got so much to learn and you just keep buckling down to learn it all. Okay. And by the time you get your PhD or whatever, I mean, you're so locked into that model that it can be hard to escape from. And so they're very strong materialists. And then otherwise they would have left neuroscience like I did eventually. And then you've got and then another group that's really among the hardest skeptics are psychologists, which you wouldn't think that that would be the case, but the reason why is that psychologists tend to they tend to focus on how gullible people are. And they tend to buy into there's more buying into the pathologizing of different things and wishful thinking and oh well, you think you saw your mother last night in a dream, that's just because you're grieving. They just rationalize it away with this sort of psychological model. And so they also can maintain their skepticism. um and
Study Carl Jung.
except for Carl Jung. But you have to realize that a lot of that is that if you go back during the time period of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, okay, you'll see that they actually were open to this stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
Sigmund Freud
Oh, yeah.
actually, I mean, they both, believed that this stuff was real. Okay, Einstein, too,
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Einstein, I think, was a mystic.
yeah. So if you go back 100 years and you look at who were the great minds back then, they took this stuff seriously.
Right.
And so it's kind of like instead of us going and thinking, wow, these great minds thought all of this and maybe there's something to it, somehow we got locked into this, we'll just ignore that. We
That's
won't
fringe.
get in the edge. Yeah, well, we'll ignore that and pretend that didn't happen. Pretend that Newton wasn't an alchemist. You know, and, just pretend. That all these great scientific minds. Kepler was also an astrologer. Let's just forget about all that stuff and just label it all woo, because we want you to fall into the materialist paradigm and not give any of that any thought. And so, yeah, at a very impressionable age, people enter into the educational system and they come out materialists until um, until they have some kind of life experience that causes ontological shock, where they're just
I
like,
see.
wait a
Yeah.
minute, what happened here?
Well, I think it was Max Planck who said science progresses through a series of funerals.
Yeah, yes, that's one of my favorite sayings.
I wonder how many physicists are closet mystics. And they're
Um,
afraid to say anything because they'll lose their funding, right?
well, physicists can get away with saying things. They don't have to quite as much. It's much more dangerous if somebody who's in the medical and social sciences says, and it's particularly dangerous for someone like me, a psychiatrist, because we're the ones who are supposed to certify whether people are sane or not. And if we're willing to consider that, I mean, the classic hallmarks of insanity are also statements that people have these abilities that we would label as ESP. I mean, I mean, the majority of it is just that.
Mhm.
And And so it's problematic. I mean, I have a patient who, to show you how extreme it is, I have a patient who she's a major equestrian, and she spends a lot of time with horses, and she really feels this strong bond with horses, and she can read them. She can tell if they're not doing well. Okay.
Mhm.
And um, and she can even do that with horses that are on her own. Okay. And she told this to her doctor. Um, and her doctor told her he was going to put her on, he recommended giving her this medication that's an antipsychotic.
Yeah.
And she came, and she came to me, she's like, Dr. Powell, can you believe this guy was going to put me on an antipsychotic because I told him about my relationship with horses. And I said, yeah, that's about the thinking
It
of
should be criminal. It should be criminal, really, because of the outcome if she had taken the antipsychotics, you know?
but they have a lot of major side effects.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That is unbelievable.
Yeah, but it's the reality. But what I see is this younger generation of the younger generation of people are much more open to this. I mean, they
Mhm.
grew up with Harry Potter books, they
I love
well,
Harry Potter books.
yeah. So I think that just like Star Trek, helped to create, this sort of age that we live in now where we've got all these devices that seemed like sci-fi, when, we were all young. Um, Similarly, kind of some of this Harry Potter like stuff, is stuff that this generation is they're much more open to. They're much more open to sort of this mysticism.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um, well, the thing is that they say that a mental health issue is due to a chemical imbalance, right? But what is what causes the chemical imbalance? Even if it is a even if it is a mental health issue, what, it the body, I don't think the body is the causal plane. I think that it's where things manifest,
mhm, mhm.
right? But not so much, yeah, I mean, unless you break your arm or something, then that's different. But would you talk about the Möbius mind that you write about in your book? Is that too much of a switch here? Because it's something that I would love to hear more, or our audience to know more about the Möbius mind.
Yeah. Well, I became familiar with as a child. I became familiar with the Mobius strip, and the Mobius strip is something that you can create by taking a strip of paper and putting a twist in it, and then taping the two ends to one another, and you get something that looks kind of like an infinity symbol. But what's remarkable about the Mobius strip is that the inside and the outside are one and the same surface. If you were to take a pencil and you were to draw it on the outside, you'd end up on the inside and then back out on the outside again. And I used that as an analogy for basically the relationship between our inner world and our outer world. That, in other words, that we think of our inner world and our outer world as being separate from one another, but really they're both actually um, uh, like the Mobius strip. They look like they're two separate things, but they're really one and the same. And and I think that that's one of the reasons why they can each inform one another. We think of we know that we think of as the external world informs our inner world because our sensory system takes in all this information that we see, hear, taste, touch. Okay. But then there's occasionally we have these experiences where we see that our inner world, our thoughts,
Mhm.
will actually create a shift in the external world. That I oftentimes had this experience where I might have a thought, and then the next thing I know, it happened. And like I might have a
Yes.
thought, like gee, I really don't feel like doing this today. I just don't have the energy for this. And then I'll get a message from somebody saying, I really need to cancel, or I can't do this
Mhm.
today. And I didn't have to be the one who
Mhm.
canceled it, just having the thought I didn't want to do it.
Mhm.
And I end up having it stop. And so that's what I mean. Not
Yeah.
something that's like totally, out of reality, weird stuff. But it's more this, it's within the realm of possibility,
Right.
but it's just, but the,
Synchronicities.
but the synchronicity of it is
Yeah.
such that it kind of defies probability, but
Yeah.
it's not out of the realm of possibility.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, uh, I one of the books that we also study is The Course in Miracles. And in that book, it talks about how our perception is actually a projection. What we perceive is what we're projecting. And so it's the inside. It's not exactly causing the outside, but it's that what we see is not the reality. And so, in that sense, it's a projection.
Right. It's not that we're like a projector, like a movie
No.
projector. It's more that our expectation, our belief system,
Mhm.
influences what we actually perceive.
Exactly.
You can have
Yeah.
two people looking at the same thing and have totally different perceptions of
Yes.
it because of something about their particular mindset or past experience.
Yes. And I love the statement that you made. I can't remember if it was in your book or in a podcast that I watched. Um, we live in a sea of consciousness people call God.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I love that. Okay. Well, gosh, there's so much else. Oh, one last thing before we switch to the Q&A that I think is so important is suicide among young people.
Mm-hmm.
And and we have this materialist paradigm that teaches them that there's really no meaning to life. And by the time they're, preteen or teens, that they've bought that. And it reminded me of a story that Jeremy Taylor, this I don't know, he was a dream worker, wonderful, intuitive. He told a story about how he was doing a workshop with Robert Johnson, who also wrote a number of books on dreams. Both of them did. And Robert Johnson was saying to the participants in the workshop, whatever your unconscious tells you to do, you must heed it. And this one young man raised his hand and he said, well, my unconscious is telling me to kill myself. So what do you say to that? And Robert Johnson said, if your unconscious is telling you to kill yourself, by all means, do it. And he kind of slammed his hand on the table and he paused while everyone gasped. And he said, just do no harm to your body. Okay. So when I heard that, I thought, if these kids could only understand that it's when they're having suicidal ideation, that it's an important message, but it's not about doing harm to your body. It's about the need for change, the need to change your mind, the need for societal change, whatever it might be.
Absolutely. I mean, when I was a teenager, I actually did volunteer work for the suicide hotline for teenagers.
I
Uh,
did too.
I've been doing this for a long time. You did too?
Not as a teenager, as a young adult. I was
Yeah.
in my 20s. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that it's I really having been a psychiatrist for over 40 years, I'm aware of the mindset of somebody who is suicidal and how
Mhm.
dark the world looks to them. And they're really they're just wanting relief, um and it's really important to to help them to understand that what they're needing relief from is really a toxic mindset
Yes.
that is not their fault. Okay.
Right.
It's not your fault. You're thinking this. Okay.
Mhm.
But there is this greater reality. And that's one of the reasons why I, have moved into more like working towards getting a documentary done and whatnot, is I'm really wanting to, on a large scale, because there are a lot of people out there, not just teenagers, there are a lot of people out there that just have given up hope. And I'm really wanting people to realize that we are part of a greater reality um, that I I see, and I know from my own experience as a therapist, I've seen people who were really hopeless and really were close to killing themselves or even tried killing themselves before they came to see me. And then they later on thanked me because they didn't. They thanked me because they now understood why they were alive. They now were glad they were alive. They see that it would have been a tragedy if they had followed through with that. And so I really want to see that kind of uplifting for a large section of our population.
Yeah, I would too. Okay, well, I still have tons of questions, but I'm
Sure
going
you
to
do.
restrain. I'm going to restrain myself and open it up to questions from our audience. And again, if you want, and I see a couple of things in the chat already, so I'm going to look at that. And if you want to ask a question, should be a button that says raise hand because I can't see all of you. So I see Sharon's hand is up. Let me just check on the chat real quick. Tink has a question, 3 questions. First question, are you psychic, Diane?
Am I psychic? I have had my moments for sure. Yeah. Yeah. What
Mm.
did she ask? I'm curious.
Why did she ask? I don't know, but maybe she'll tell us.
Oh,
Um,
oh, Dr.
oh, there you
Powell,
are.
I asked because I thought sometime, and I work in psychiatry and mental health. I'm a psych nurse practitioner. I just think the things that interest us the most just have personal meaning.
Mm.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. That's interesting. I became I became convinced that these things are real because of what I witnessed with the patient. But then what happened is that once I became convinced it was real, I started having more of those experiences myself. And that's what some people have told me that my book has done for them, is that once they saw, oh, sure, this makes, sense, it's like it gave them permission. And so then it's like you kind of bypass that censorship machine that, keeps us from ever having those kind of experiences.
And I literally think we're all psychic, and it's just a question of training
Yeah, and
intuition.
belief. And
And
belief.
it's just a question of conditioning that we don't think we are, and so we don't have the experiences, or we dismiss them if we do have them. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, Tink, you had another question.
What was my second one?
Can you speak about Sylvia Browne's work with cell memory and past lives?
Um, Well, I remember reading, boy, it's been a long time since I've read Sylvia Browne, but what I would say is this, that I also believe the evidence for reincarnation. is profound. A lot of that is the work that was done by Ian Stevenson, looking
Yes. We've
cases.
had Jim Tucker present for us.
Yeah. So, that amazing research that's been done there. And when it comes to cellular memory, can you elaborate what exactly you mean by that? Because I know that there's, you have everything from these studies that have been done on people that have had heart transplants, where some of the characteristics of the person whose heart was transplanted into the recipient were transmitted along with the heart. And then you also have these cases when it comes to past lives where somebody will have like a birthmark or
corresponding
some kind of structural defect that corresponds to some way that they died in a past life. And so that suggests to me that the what we're calling cellular memory is, I think it's really memory that is contained within our field that then gets expressed in the cell. Yeah, that it's sort of like it's as I said earlier, I think the consciousness creates the physical form, rather than arising from the physical form. And so the consciousness, it's got within it sort of, it affected the blueprint that the consciousness is operating from, that's creating the physical. That makes sense.
Totally. And what you said, I was thinking, but I was also thinking cell memory in issues that somehow affect your behavior or your thoughts in this life are from a past life that are unresolved, maybe like abandonment issues or fear of something, or the core issues that we all struggle with.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think that I think that that's probably one of the reasons we reincarnate, is to sort of work through some of that stuff. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I did have one final question, but if someone else wants to jump in, I can hold off.
Okay, well, let's hear from Sharon and we'll get back to your third question, Tink, okay?
Sure.
Sharon's been waiting.
Well, I saw Tink's third question and I had my question already, but they may be kind of similar, so we'll see. I have a loved one who's what I would call neurodivergent, which is when he was first he was diagnosed with depression, then he was diagnosed with anxiety, then it was autism, but Asperger's end of the spectrum, late in life diagnosis. But things have gotten worse, and then we get these other diagnoses like bipolar, and it's become almost, it's not funny, but it's almost, the joke is every time he meets with a different psychologist, he gets another different diagnosis. The fortunate thing potentially is that they all fall under the umbrella of neurodivergence. And so I'm just curious, because from my experience, that's a relatively new term. It's not one that we heard a decade ago when we sort of embarked on this path. So I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are about that term and how it relates to your book, because when you wrote your book, I'm guessing that term wasn't really one that was in use. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on neurodivergence in general, how it relates to.
I like the term neurodivergent more than I do, autistic spectrum. I think it's a more accurate description, because really all it's saying is that their brains are wired differently. That's all it's saying. That they process information differently, their brains are wired differently. Don't project onto them expectations about what they're experiencing based on what you experience. Okay. Don't judge them based on those kinds of things. And a lot of them have abilities that, are enviable. A lot of people are like, wow, I wish I could do that. I wish it was that easy for me. So it really takes it away from being pathologizing and really, and then speaking to your earlier statements about, all of these different, diagnoses. That is one of the major problems with psychiatry and their diagnostic schema. And I really compare it to the, that that story about the elephant that has all these blind Indian men that are, one's filling the trunk and saying it's one thing, and then others filling the tail and saying it's another thing. And so it's so often I see within psychiatry that because it's all syndrome based. And so it's sort of like, well, okay, if I'm somebody who really focuses on emotional dysregulation, and I'm paying attention to that part of the story, I might think of somebody as bipolar because, oh, your mood is this today and it's down the next day. And, oh, that sounds like rapid cycling bipolar disorder. Okay. Or somebody else might be focusing on, more of the, oh, this kid can't concentrate. Okay, and then, they're going to give them a diagnosis of ADD, or they're going to give them a diagnosis of OCD, both of which are concentration problems. Um, and, or are we going to focus on the fact that the kid, is really fidgety and anxious because this is really traumatic to be, neurodivergent, living in a world where people don't understand you. You're getting a lot of your needs, ignored, and you don't know what your future is going to be like, And so it's like, which one of these things we're going to focus on, and then, and of course, there's a medication for each one of those. You can see these kids that end up, they've got the medications piled high, and the kid's sick, drugged out of their gourd. And what? Because he could, he's now not fit. He's not fidgeting in his seat anymore. You think you've done this kid a favor? No, you haven't. And so I really think that psychiatry is in need of major reform, and so I also think that we really need to be looking at, on these non-pathologizing labels that do a better job of describing actually what the person is dealing with.
Yes, thank you. And so just to kind of wrap it up, would you say that based on how the term neurodivergence is currently being used, would you say that some noticeable percentage of those folks exhibit some of the ESP?
Absolutely.
So there is still a correlation, whether you're using the individual terms of the disorders that the DSM-5 would use, or whether you're using the term neurodivergence. You would say, based on the work you've done, there's still a correlation of some degree, noticeable correlation between folks who are neurodivergent and some of these abilities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean,
okay.
And a lot of, like, if you listen to like Temple Grandin sort of describe the different cognitive processing styles of people that are neurodivergent, one of them is visual spatial thinking. And another one is pattern thinking. And I'm a pattern thinker. And I see the connections of things between things. I mean, it's like that for me, but I wouldn't think of myself as being autistic, but I know for sure I'm neurodivergent. I mean, when I was in school, I remember being kept after class in a physics class because the teacher thought that I had cheated on a test. And I said, why do you think I cheated on the test? And he said, well, because I don't see any work here. And I said, well, it's because I did it all in my head. And he said, well, show me that you can do it, and I went to the chalkboard and I showed him I could do it, and he said, okay, sorry.
That's great.
I mean, this was in college, so, if it had been high school, I wouldn't have had a problem because my high school teachers knew, about me and they trusted me entirely. But this teacher didn't know me from Adam. So there's something about my mind that works differently than other people's, and it's one of those things where then if you're somebody whose mind already works differently and you're not locked into the linear way of thinking, which is more the verbal thinkers, which is the most rigid form of thinking, then you're not locked into that sort of, very dogmatic way of thinking about the world. And so I think that it's not necessarily so much that pattern recognition or visual spatial skills being your dominant form of thinking necessarily in and of itself lends itself to it. It's that it sort of takes you out of that usual brainwashing, programming towards this way of thinking, and you're more open. You're more open to the possibility. And if we all have these as innate abilities, but we just get kind of talked out of believing that they're possible, then you're less susceptible to that kind of a thing.
Yeah, plus people like possibly you and someone like Daniel Tammet,
Mm-hmm.
who, they, it's not that they're necessarily doing the math, they just have the answer. I mean, they don't even go through the process that we're taught to go through to get to that answer. I remember I don't know, it was a tape that I heard many years ago with Jean Houston, and she was describing this little boy who could do math like that. He couldn't do it the normal way. Like if he tried to do it the way he was taught in school, he would get the wrong answer. But if you just asked him what the answer was, he'd give the right answer. But he couldn't do it, arithmetically, maybe I don't know. It's very interesting because it's like you're tapping into this, maybe the consciousness field, the field. Oh, I did want to ask you about the force field. Well, maybe another time. Maybe that's too big a subject. Okay, so who else has a question? Tink wanted to know, what is the role of the gut? More brain cells than the brain.
Oh, that wasn't mine.
Oh, that wasn't yours. Oh, I'm sorry. Whose is that? Oh, that's Lorraine, I think. That's Lorraine. Do you want to answer that? What is the role
sure.
of the gut?
Yeah. Well, so the gut, it's true that, the gut has its own neural network, but it's nowhere near as many neurons as the brain has. But it is, it's called the second brain by many people. But the gut is, so there's this connection, though, that people make with the gut where they talk about, gut instinct, and really, it's more of it's like a visceral feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So some people have this sort of that's information. Okay, that it's really a form of Gestalt information, because you can have your mind can talk you into something. Okay, and then you get this visceral feeling of dread. Okay. And rather than try to talk yourself out of the dread, what I always recommend is that people try to explore the source of the dread, and try to break it apart and understand, what is this about? And oftentimes you'll find that really what it is it's giving you a quick and dirty answer that you could use to choose, well, I guess maybe I shouldn't be doing this if I'm dreading it. Sometimes we dread something, and it's all the more reason why we have to do it. That's part of why you have to do the explanation for, why are you feeling this dread? But you have. So anyway, so the point is that's, or a gut feeling of, I don't know if I could trust this person, or why did I feel anxious when I'm around this person? You're picking up something that you should pay some attention to, but just at least pay attention to it to analyze it, But the other thing is that we also know that the gut plays a huge role in brain function, because the neurotransmitters that the brain uses are manufactured in the gut by gut bacteria. And so a lot of these kids that have problems nowadays, it's because their gut bacteria are so, they've lost all this diversity because of the kind of diets that we're eating. And they've also lost diversity because of, a lot of things that kill off the good bacteria. And so we know that there's these issues with kids that sometimes are radically improved by a fecal transplant. And all that's happening is that you're giving the kid some of these gut bacteria that help to populate the gut with a healthier array that can then give them some of the some of the neurotransmitter, the more appropriate balance of neurotransmitters that their brain needs for them to really function properly. So those are all the different things that I think of associated with gut, so.
Okay. Lorraine also asks a question that I had on my list but didn't get to, which is, are we living in a hologram?
Well,
A holographic universe.
I absolutely believe that we're living in a holographic universe.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much evidence that things are arranged holographically. And I think that it makes, one of the reasons why it makes so much sense to me is that all of the information about the whole is contained in each of the parts. And so if each of us is a piece of the hologram, then that could explain how it is that we have potentially access to all, that to the total consciousness field, because that all of that is contained within our own individual consciousness field.
Okay. And so if we do live in a holographic or in a hologram, then are we creating it?
I think we're co-creating it.
Yes, I would say so too. Okay. Okay, so Bob has a question. How do you help clients distinguish between the various healthy inner voices and those that aren't? That's a good question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you have to pay attention to what are the voices saying to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
a matter of discernment.
It's a matter of discernment, and it's also I mean, you can think about, well, okay, what this voice is saying to me, what's the effect of this voice? Okay. Do I feel bad if I pay attention to that voice, or do I feel good if I pay attention to that voice? Does that voice cause me to do something that actually causes my life to go better and for me to get along better with other people? Or does that voice cause me to do things that alienate me from people or alienate me from the world? So I think that you have to look at those kinds of factors. What is the result of that voice? And then that helps you to discern whether or not it's a healthy voice or not a healthy voice. And it's interesting. I mean, I have had patients that, were diagnosed as schizophrenic, that hear voices, and they're put on a medication that take the voices away, and they're like, I miss my voices. They were my friends. And I'm like, it's this assumption that people always want to, that it's not necessarily that these people are plagued by the voices. I mean, some people, it's, maybe it's their inner muses or their voices. Who knows?
Yeah.
But you have to take everything on a case-by-case basis. Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, so I think it's Tink also asked, also would like to hear about increase in psychic abilities in folks with bipolar illness or other mental health issues.
And maybe like the biochemistry or it's a big topic for our time, but I just think it's got to be related to feelings and just so much. But what are you thinking?
About bipolar disorder? I mean, I think that people that have bipolar disorder are among the group that report more psychic abilities. Absolutely. And the reason for that, could be a couple of different things. Number one is that people who have bipolar disorder, by definition, have highs and lows. Okay, and so they're having during the highs, their thinking is sped up, and during the times when your thinking is sped up, you're processing information differently. They actually are experiencing time differently. And so one of the things, just like, when people have, they're in a panic state, okay, and they have all of this adrenaline released, time can seem like it's slowed down. And it's almost like time really did slow down, because you can have time to do all the things that you needed to do to save yourself or someone that you care about in a miracle split second. You do exactly, but the person who's actually in that state experiences time is slowed down. So there's something about these intense emotional states that affects, I think, space-time itself. I'm totally fascinated by that, and these are the kinds of questions I would ask. But also, in a more simplistic, statement as well, getting back to like brain function, when you have a lot of emotionality, your limbic system is really overactive, more active than, let's say, the cortical areas of the brain. And I believe that the limbic system plays a role in these abilities. The limbic system and the right hemisphere work together. Okay. And so I think that it's sort of people who are more limbic dominant, actually have a more dominant right hemisphere. And as a result, and everything that we've discussed about the right hemisphere comes into play. So
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Diane. It's really, I encourage people to read the book, because there's so much more than what we discussed tonight. And thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next time.
okay.
Thank you for your work, Diane.
Yeah, you're welcome.